The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the weathered saloon, and Eleanor Hayes stepped down into the dust of Redemption, Texas, wondering if she had made the greatest mistake of her 22 years. The August heat of 1878 pressed down on her like a heavy blanket, stealing the breath from her lungs as she surveyed the main street of what would now be her home. Redemption was smaller than she had imagined, just a collection of sun-bleached buildings clustered along a dirt road that stretched into endless prairie on both sides. Back in Philadelphia, the advertisements had painted the West as a land of opportunity and adventure. But standing here now with dust settling on her traveling dress and the weight of her carpetbag pulling at her shoulder, Eleanor felt the first real pangs of doubt creeping into her heart. She had come west to teach school, answering an advertisement placed by the town council seeking an educated woman to instruct the children of Redemption. The salary was modest, but included room and board in a cottage behind the schoolhouse. More importantly, it was an escape from the suffocating expectations of her family, who had wanted her to marry Theodore Blackwell, a banker's son with soft hands and an even softer spine. Eleanor had wanted more from life than becoming a decoration in someone else's parlor, so she had packed her bags and bought a ticket west, leaving behind a furious mother and a bewildered father. Now, watching a tumbleweed roll past her feet, she wondered if she had traded one kind of prison for another. "You must be the new schoolteacher." The voice came from behind her, and Eleanor turned to find a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. My husband runs the general store. Welcome to Redemption." Eleanor managed a smile despite the homesickness already gnawing at her chest. "Thank you, I am Eleanor Hayes." "Let me help you with your bags," Margaret said, reaching for one of Eleanor's trunks. "The schoolhouse is just down the street." "It is not much, but we have tried to make it comfortable for you." As they walked, Margaret pointed out the various establishments that made up the town. The saloon, the general store, the blacksmith, the small church with its simple wooden cross, and the sheriff's office. Eleanor counted perhaps 24 buildings in total, and she felt her heart sink further. Philadelphia had bustling streets and theaters and libraries and parks. Redemption had dust and silence, and an emptiness that seemed to stretch on forever. The schoolhouse was a modest single-room building painted white, though the paint had begun to peel in places. Behind it stood a small cottage with a covered porch and 2 windows facing east. Margaret produced a key and unlocked the door, ushering Eleanor inside. The cottage consisted of 3 rooms, a combination kitchen and sitting area, a bedroom barely large enough for a narrow bed and dresser, and a small washroom. The furniture was simple but well made, and someone had placed fresh wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Despite its humble appearance, Eleanor could see that care had been taken to make the space welcoming. "I know it is not what you are used to," Margaret said, watching Eleanor's face carefully. "But folks here are good people, and they are excited to have a proper teacher for their children." The last one only stayed 6 months before heading back east. Eleanor set down her carpetbag and turned to face Margaret with what she hoped was a confident expression. "I am sure it will be just fine. When do I begin teaching?" "School starts Monday morning." "That gives you 3 days to settle in and prepare. If you need anything, the general store is open every day except Sunday. My husband Frank and I live in the rooms above the store, so do not hesitate to come find us if you need help with anything." After Margaret left, Eleanor unpacked her belongings slowly, hanging her few dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her books on a shelf someone had built into the wall. She had brought her most treasured volumes: Shakespeare, Dickens, Austen, Whitman, and several textbooks for teaching. As she placed each book on the shelf, she felt the distance between her old life and her new one growing wider. That evening, Eleanor sat on the porch of her cottage watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky transformed into brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, more vivid than any sunset she had ever seen in Philadelphia. The beauty of it made her chest ache. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. The vastness of the landscape seemed to emphasize her own insignificance, and for the first time since leaving home, she allowed herself to cry. The sound of hoofbeats on the road made her wipe her eyes quickly. A rider was approaching, silhouetted against the sunset. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out a tall figure on a paint horse, sitting in the saddle with the easy grace of someone who had spent most of his life on horseback. He slowed as he passed the schoolhouse, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Evening, ma'am," he called out. His voice was deep and warm, carrying easily across the distance between them. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirts. "Good evening." The rider turned his horse toward her cottage, stopping a respectful distance away. Now Eleanor could see him more clearly. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that seemed to hold both kindness and wariness in equal measure. His clothes marked him as a working cowboy: worn denim pants, a faded blue shirt, leather vest, and dusty boots with spurs. A gun belt hung low on his hips and a rope was coiled at his saddle. "You must be the new schoolteacher," he said. "Welcome to Redemption. I am James Cordell. I work at the Double R Ranch about 5 miles north of here." "Eleanor Hayes," she replied, descending the porch steps. "It is nice to meet you, Mr. Cordell. Just James, please." He dismounted, leading his horse closer. "How are you finding our town so far?" Eleanor hesitated, not wanting to seem ungrateful but unable to muster false enthusiasm. "It is quite different from what I am accustomed to." James smiled, and the expression transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely warm. "That is the politest way I have ever heard someone say that redemption is not much to look at. Where are you from?" "Philadelphia." He let out a low whistle. "That is quite a change. What brings a city girl all the way out here to teach in a dusty Texas town?" There was no mockery in his tone, only genuine curiosity. Eleanor found herself responding honestly. "I wanted something different. I wanted to be useful, to make a difference, and I suppose I wanted an adventure." "Well, you certainly came to the right place for different," James said. "Though I should warn you that adventure out here tends to come in the form of dust storms and the occasional rattlesnake rather than anything particularly exciting." Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. "I shall try not to be too disappointed." They talked for a few more minutes, James telling her about the ranch where he worked and the families whose children would be her students. He had an easy manner that put Eleanor somewhat at ease, and by the time he tipped his hat and rode away into the gathering darkness, she felt marginally better about her situation. Over the next 3 days, Eleanor threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse for her students. She scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and arranged the desks in neat rows. She prepared lesson plans for students ranging from age 6 to 15, knowing she would have to teach multiple grades simultaneously. Several townspeople stopped by to introduce themselves and offer assistance, and Eleanor began to put names to faces. Monday morning arrived with brutal sunshine and temperatures that were already climbing by 8 o'clock. Eleanor stood at the schoolhouse door in her best teaching dress, watching as families brought their children to school. She counted 17 students in total, from little Emma Sullivan, who was barely 6 years old, to tall, gangly Daniel Peterson, who was 15 and looked mortified to still be in school. The first day was challenging. The younger children were shy and uncertain, while the older ones tested her authority with whispers and giggles. Eleanor drew on every bit of her training from the teaching college she had attended in Philadelphia, maintaining firm but fair discipline while trying to make the lessons engaging. By the time she dismissed the students at 3 o'clock, she was exhausted, and her voice was hoarse from projecting over the chatter. She was erasing the blackboard when she heard a knock at the door. Turning, she found James Cordell standing in the doorway, hat in hand. "Hope I am not disturbing you," he said. "I was riding past and thought I would see how your first day went." Eleanor set down the eraser and brushed chalk dust from her hands. "It went as well as could be expected, I suppose. The children are spirited," James laughed. "That is a kind way of putting it. I went to school in that very room when I was a boy. I recall giving our teacher, Mr. Henderson, quite a hard time. What made you stop attending? Eleanor asked, curious. My father died when I was 14. I had to go to work to help support my mother and younger sister. That was 11 years ago. A shadow passed across his face. My mother passed 5 years back. My sister married a rancher up in Montana, so now it is just me. I am sorry for your losses, Eleanor said softly. James shrugged, but she could see the old pain in his eyes. Life out here is hard. You learn to accept it and keep moving forward. Speaking of which, have you had supper yet? Eleanor blinked at the sudden change of subject. I was planning to make something at home, Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house makes the best chicken and dumplings in 3 counties. Would you allow me to buy you supper? I figure it is the least the town can do to welcome you properly. Eleanor knew she should probably decline. It would not be proper to be seen dining alone with a man she barely knew. But loneliness gnawed at her, and the prospect of returning to her empty cottage to eat a solitary meal was deeply unappealing. Besides, this was the West, not Philadelphia. Perhaps the rules were different here. That would be very nice. Thank you. The boarding house was attached to the general store, a communal dining room where Mrs. Patterson served meals to boarders and anyone else willing to pay 50 cents for a plate. The room was already half full when James and Eleanor arrived, and several heads turned to watch them enter. Eleanor felt the weight of curious eyes assessing her, judging the propriety of a young schoolteacher dining with a cowboy. If James noticed the attention, he did not show it. He guided her to a table by the window and held her chair as she sat, displaying manners that surprised her. Mrs. Patterson, a plump woman with flour permanently dusting her apron, bustled over to take their order, her eyes twinkling with barely suppressed gossip. The chicken and dumplings were indeed delicious, and Eleanor found herself relaxing as she and James talked. He asked about Philadelphia and seemed genuinely fascinated by her descriptions of the city. In turn, he told her about life on the ranch, painting vivid pictures of cattle drives and breaking horses and sleeping under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. You ever miss the city? James asked, sopping up gravy with a piece of bread. Eleanor considered the question carefully. I miss certain things. The libraries, the concerts, the theater, but I do not miss the constraints. In Philadelphia, every moment of my life was prescribed. How I should dress, what I should say, whom I should marry. Out here, I feel like I can breathe. Even though the West is lonely, James asked quietly, the question struck her like a physical blow because it was exactly what she had been thinking but had not dared say aloud. Yes, she admitted. The West is lonelier than I had imagined. Everything is so vast, so empty. Sometimes I feel like I could disappear and no one would even notice. James reached across the table and gently touched her hand. The gesture was brief, just a moment of contact, but it sent warmth spreading through Eleanor's chest. Not anymore, he said, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Not anymore, you are here. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor felt her cheeks flush, and for a moment she could not look away from him. Something had shifted in that instant. Some invisible line had been crossed, and both of them knew it. James cleared his throat and pulled his hand back, seeming suddenly self-conscious. What I mean is, folks here will notice you. You matter to this town. Those children need you. Thank you, Eleanor managed, her voice barely above a whisper. That means more than you know. They finished their meal in companionable silence, but Eleanor was acutely aware of James's presence beside her. When he walked her home afterward, the evening air had cooled slightly, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. They paused at her porch steps, neither quite ready to part ways. May I call on you again? James asked, turning his hat in his hands. Eleanor knew she should be cautious. She had come west to teach, not to entangle herself with a cowboy. But standing there in the gathering darkness with James looking at her with such hopeful uncertainty, caution seemed less important than the connection she felt growing between them. "I would like that very much," she said. James's smile could have lit the whole prairie. "Good. I will see you soon then, Eleanor." He said her name like it was something precious, and Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. She watched him mount his horse and ride away before going inside, where she leaned against the closed door and tried to make sense of the feelings swirling inside her. The weeks that followed fell into a pattern. Eleanor taught during the day, pouring her energy into educating her students. She discovered that once they accepted her authority, the children were eager to learn. Even Daniel Peterson, who had seemed so sullen that first day, showed an aptitude for mathematics that impressed her. The younger children adored her, especially little Emma Sullivan, who brought her wildflowers almost every day in the evenings. James would often ride into town, and they would walk together or sit on her porch talking until the stars came out. He taught her about the constellations visible in the clear Texas sky, pointing out the Big Dipper and Cassiopeia and Orion. She read him passages from her favorite books, introducing him to worlds beyond the prairie. Eleanor learned that James was an orphan who had worked harder than any person she had ever known. He had been just a ranch hand when they first met, but he had dreams of one day owning his own land. He saved every spare penny, planning and hoping for a future he could barely articulate but desperately wanted. For his part, James seemed fascinated by everything about Eleanor. He loved hearing her talk about books and music and art, subjects that were foreign to him but that he absorbed with genuine interest. He made her laugh with stories about mishaps on the ranch, like the time he had been thrown into a watering trough by an ornery bull, or when he accidentally lassoed his boss instead of a runaway calf. The townspeople noticed the growing attachment between their schoolteacher and the cowboy. Some approved, seeing in James a hard-working young man who would make a good husband. Others whispered that Eleanor was setting her sights too low, that she should wait for someone with better prospects. Margaret Sullivan became Eleanor's staunchest defender, silencing gossips with sharp words and pointed looks. One October evening, as the weather finally began to cool from the brutal summer heat, James arrived at Eleanor's cottage carrying something wrapped in cloth. His expression was unusually serious as he dismounted and approached the porch. "I have something for you," he said, holding out the bundle. Eleanor unwrapped it carefully to find a beautiful leather-bound journal, its cover tooled with an intricate design of wildflowers. "James, this is lovely. But you should not have spent money on me." "I wanted to," he said simply. "You are always talking about how much you love to write, and I thought you might like a place to put down your thoughts about your time here. That way, even if you decide to go back east someday, you will have a record of your adventure." The implication that she might leave made Eleanor's chest tighten. The truth was that redemption had stopped feeling temporary somewhere along the way. She no longer thought about Philadelphia every day, no longer compared everything here unfavorably to her old life. The West had worked its way into her heart, and so had James. "I am not planning to leave," she said softly. James looked up sharply, hope kindling in his eyes. "You are not?" "No. I have realized something over these past months. Home is not a place, it is a feeling, and I feel more at home here in Redemption than I ever did in Philadelphia." "Eleanor." James stepped closer, and she could see the emotions playing across his face. "I need to tell you something. I have been trying to find the right words for weeks now, but there is no easy way to say it, so I am just going to speak plain. I love you. I have loved you since that first evening when you told me the West was lonelier than you had imagined, and I realized that maybe I had been lonely too. I just had not known it until you came along and filled that empty space." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She had known, of course. The awareness had been growing between them like a living thing, impossible to ignore. But hearing James say the words aloud made them real in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. "I know I do not have much to offer," James continued, the words tumbling out now as if he needed to say everything before he lost his nerve. "I am just a cowboy with more dreams than money, but I work hard and I am saving for land of my own. I could build us a house, not much at first, but solid. I would take care of you, Eleanor. I would spend every day of my life trying to make you happy if you would give me the chance. James. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, marveling at how right it felt to touch him, as if their hands had been made to fit together. I do not care about what you have or do not have. I love you too. I think I have loved you since that first evening when you told me that I mattered, that the West was not lonely anymore because I was here. No one has ever made me feel the way you do, like I am seen and valued for who I truly am rather than who I am supposed to be. James pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. Eleanor rested her head against his chest, hearing the rapid beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other as the stars emerged overhead. "Will you marry me?" James whispered against her hair. Eleanor pulled back just enough to look up at him, seeing vulnerability and love and hope all mixed together in his expression. "Yes. Yes, I will marry you." James kissed her then, a gentle press of lips that spoke of promises and possibilities. Eleanor kissed him back, feeling like she had finally found the place where she was meant to be. They announced their engagement the next day, and the town erupted in excitement. Most of the townspeople were genuinely happy for them, though Eleanor noticed a few disapproving looks from some of the more conservative women who thought the engagement had happened too quickly. Eleanor did not care. For the first time in her life, she was making a choice based purely on what her heart wanted, and it felt gloriously liberating. James spoke to the pastor about performing the ceremony, and they set the date for December, giving them 2 months to prepare. It would be a simple wedding, held in the small church with the whole town invited. Eleanor wrote to her parents announcing her engagement, not really expecting their blessing but feeling obligated to inform them. The response that came 6 weeks later was predictably angry. Her father demanding she return home immediately, and her mother bemoaning the shame Eleanor had brought on the family by refusing Theodore Blackwell only to marry a common cowboy. Eleanor read the letter once and then burned it, watching the paper curl and blacken in her stove. James continued saving money, but now his efforts had renewed urgency. He worked longer hours, taking on extra jobs wherever he could find them. He helped build a barn for a neighbor, repaired fences, and even spent a week breaking horses for a rancher 2 towns over. Eleanor worried about him working himself to exhaustion, but James was driven by the vision of the life they would build together. In late November, just 2 weeks before the wedding, James rode into town with barely contained excitement. Eleanor was sweeping the schoolhouse steps when she saw him coming, and she set aside her broom as he dismounted. "I did it," he said, grabbing her hands. "Eleanor, I did it. I bought land." Eleanor gasped. "You did? Where? How much?" 40 acres about 3 miles northwest of here. It is good grazing land with a creek running through it and some tree cover. Old man Hutchins was selling, and I had just enough saved for the down payment. I can build us a house there, start our own ranch. It will take time to build it up, but it is ours, Eleanor, our own place. Eleanor threw her arms around his neck, laughing with joy. "That is wonderful. Oh, James, I am so proud of you." "I want to take you to see it," James said. "Can you spare the time this weekend? We could ride out Saturday morning." "Yes, absolutely." Saturday dawned clear and cold, the first real bite of winter in the air. James arrived at sunrise with 2 horses, his paint gelding and a gentle bay mare he had borrowed from the ranch. Eleanor had never been particularly comfortable on horseback, but she was determined not to let that stop her from seeing their land. The ride took about an hour, and with each mile, Eleanor felt the vastness of the prairie pressing in on her again. But this time, instead of feeling lonely, she felt free. The land stretched endlessly in all directions, and somewhere out there was a piece of it that belonged to her and James. When they reached the property, Eleanor understood immediately why James had chosen it. The land rolled gently, covered in prairie grass that would feed cattle. A line of trees marked where the creek ran, providing precious water. In the distance, she could see a small rise that would be perfect for building a house. James helped her dismount and they walked the property together, James pointing out where he wanted to build the house, where the barn would go, where they could plant a garden. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Eleanor found herself caught up in the vision, adding her own ideas about where she might like a clothesline or a small chicken coop. They stood on the rise where the house would be, looking out over their land. James wrapped his arms around Eleanor from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think it is perfect," Eleanor said honestly. "I think we can build a wonderful life here." "It will not be easy," James warned. "Building a ranch from nothing, I mean. There will be lean times, hard times. I need you to know that before we get married. I do not want you to have any illusions about what this life will be like." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "James Cordell, I left a life of ease and comfort in Philadelphia to come teach in a dusty Texas town I had never heard of. I am not afraid of hard work. Besides, we will face those hard times together, and that makes all the difference." James kissed her deeply, holding her close against the November wind. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless. "2 more weeks," James said. "2 more weeks and you will be my wife." "I cannot wait," Eleanor whispered. The days leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of preparation. Margaret Sullivan helped Eleanor sew a wedding dress from ivory satin that had been ordered special from Fort Worth. It was simpler than the elaborate gowns Eleanor would have worn had she married in Philadelphia, but she loved it for its clean lines and elegant simplicity. James purchased a new suit, the first he had ever owned, and spent an evening with Frank Sullivan learning how to tie a proper necktie. The wedding took place on December 15, 1878, on a day cold enough that the church's small wood stove struggled to heat the space. Eleanor did not care. Standing at the altar beside James, watching his face as the pastor led them through their vows, she had never felt warmer or more certain of anything in her life. "I, James Cordell, take you, Eleanor Hayes, to be my wedded wife," James said, his voice steady and sure. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part." When Eleanor repeated her vows, her voice caught with emotion on the words "to love and to cherish." James squeezed her hands gently, giving her strength. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife, and when James kissed her, the small church erupted in applause. Eleanor laughed against his lips, feeling joy bubble up inside her like champagne. The reception was held in the boarding house dining room, where tables had been pushed together and covered with food prepared by every woman in town. There was roasted meat, fresh bread, vegetables preserved from the fall harvest, and 3 different cakes. Frank Sullivan produced a fiddle and played lively tunes while people danced. James, who claimed to have 2 left feet, nonetheless swept Eleanor around the floor with surprising grace. As the evening wore on and the celebration continued around them, James leaned close to Eleanor's ear. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Cordell," the name sent a thrill through her. Mrs. Cordell, she was married, she was James's wife. "Yes," she whispered back. They slipped away as the party continued, riding double on James's horse to the cottage behind the schoolhouse where they would live until their own house was built. James carried Eleanor over the threshold, both of them laughing, and closed the door on the world outside. That night, Eleanor gave herself to her husband completely, discovering a physical intimacy she had never imagined. James was gentle and patient, mindful of her innocence, and when he made love to her for the first time, Eleanor felt another wall crumble, another constraint from her old life fall away. This was freedom, this complete surrender to love and trust and desire. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, James's fingers tracing lazy patterns on Eleanor's bare shoulder. "Happy," he murmured. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Eleanor replied honestly. "James, I need you to know something. Leaving Philadelphia, coming west, it was the best decision I ever made. Not because of the adventure or the teaching, but because it brought me to you. You are my home now. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." James pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you, Eleanor Cordell. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me." "I could never regret it," she whispered. "Not in 1,000 years." The winter months tested them in ways Eleanor had not anticipated. While she continued teaching, James worked on their land whenever weather permitted, beginning the process of building their house. He felled trees along the creek for lumber, hauled stones for a foundation, and slowly, painstakingly, began constructing the home where they would raise their family. Eleanor helped when she could, spending Saturdays and school holidays on the property. She learned to swing a hammer and mix mortar, skills her Philadelphia finishing school had certainly never taught. Her hands, once soft and pale, became calloused and strong. Her face gained color from the sun, and her body grew lean and muscular from physical labor. In February, a winter storm swept across the prairie with brutal force. For 3 days, snow and ice pounded redemption. Eleanor and James huddled in the cottage, burning every piece of wood they had for fuel and wearing every article of clothing they owned to stay warm. When the storm finally passed, they emerged to find the world transformed into a white wilderness. The storm had damaged some of James's work on the house, tearing away part of the partially completed roof. Eleanor watched his face as he surveyed the damage, seeing the discouragement in his eyes. "We will fix it," she said firmly, taking his hand. "It is just wood and nails, James." "We can rebuild." He turned to her, and the love in his eyes made her breath catch. "How did I get so lucky? Most women would be crying or complaining, but you just roll up your sleeves and get back to work." "I am not most women," Eleanor said with a smile. "Besides, remember what you told me. We face the hard times together." They did rebuild, and by April the house was nearly complete. It was a modest structure with 2 bedrooms, a main living area and a kitchen, but it had glass windows and a solid roof and a stone fireplace that would keep them warm. James built a covered porch along the front where they could sit in the evenings, and Eleanor planted flowers that Margaret had given her from her own garden. They moved into the house in May, and Eleanor marveled at the strangeness of living so far from town. The silence at night was profound, broken only by the sounds of crickets and coyotes and the wind in the grass. But James was there beside her, and that made even the vast emptiness of the prairie feel like home. Eleanor continued teaching through the spring term, making the ride into town each day on the bay mare James had bought for her. She had become a competent rider, comfortable in the saddle in a way that would have shocked her Philadelphia family. In June, when school let out for the summer, she threw herself into helping James build up the ranch. They purchased 6 cows and a bull with money James had saved, the beginning of their herd. James built a small barn and fences to contain the animals. Eleanor learned to milk cows, churn butter, and tend the vegetable garden she had planted beside the house. It was backbreaking work, but there was satisfaction in seeing tangible results from their efforts. One evening in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Eleanor realized her monthly courses were late. She had been feeling slightly nauseous in the mornings, and her breasts were tender. She knew what it likely meant, but she was afraid to hope, afraid to jinx it by speaking the possibility aloud. She waited another week before telling James, wanting to be certain. When she finally spoke the words, "I think I am going to have a baby," James's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He whooped with joy, swept her into his arms, and spun her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "Eleanor, we are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction made the question unnecessary. "Happy, I am over the moon, Eleanor, this is the best news I have ever received." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Our child is in there, part you, part me. A whole new person we made together." Eleanor covered his hand with hers, tears streaming down her face. "I love you so much, James. I love you too, both of you. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the fall. Eleanor continued teaching until October, when the physical demands became too much. Margaret Sullivan assured her the town would find a temporary teacher until Eleanor was ready to return after the baby came. Eleanor felt guilty about leaving her students, but she also knew she needed to take care of herself and the child she carried. As her belly grew, James became increasingly protective. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the ranch, barely letting Eleanor lift anything heavier than a dish. She found his concern endearing, even when it became a bit stifling. He built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it until there was not a single rough edge. Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how impossibly small they seemed. In March of 1880, on a night when the wind howled around the house and rain drummed on the roof, Eleanor went into labor. James rode through the storm to fetch Margaret, who had agreed to serve as midwife. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. There were moments when Eleanor thought she could not endure another contraction, moments when she was certain she would die from the pain. But James never left her side. He held her hand, wiped her forehead with cool cloths and whispered encouragement. "You can do this, Eleanor. You are the strongest person I know. Just a little more, my love, just a little more." Finally, as dawn light was beginning to filter through the windows, Eleanor gave one last tremendous push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Margaret announced, placing the squirming infant on Eleanor's chest. "A healthy baby boy." Eleanor looked down at her son through tears of exhaustion and joy. He was red and wrinkled and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and tiny fists that waved in the air. James leaned over them, his own eyes wet with tears. "Hello, little one," Eleanor whispered. "We have been waiting so long to meet you." "He is perfect," James said, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Eleanor. You brought our son into the world." They named him Thomas James Cordell, after James's father. Little Thomas was a good baby, quiet and content, seeming to reserve his crying for when he was truly hungry or needed changing. Eleanor marveled at how quickly she fell into the rhythms of motherhood, her body knowing instinctively how to nourish and comfort her child. James was a devoted father from the first moment. He would hold Thomas for hours, talking to him about the ranch and the cattle and how one day this would all be his. He changed diapers without complaint and walked the floor with Thomas when Eleanor was too exhausted to rise. "You are a natural at this," Eleanor told him one night as she watched him rock Thomas to sleep. James smiled down at their son. "I always wanted to be a father. I wanted to do it right, to be the kind of father mine was before he died, patient and kind and present." "You are all those things and more," Eleanor assured him. As Thomas grew from an infant into a chubby, happy baby, the ranch continued to grow as well. Their herd increased to 20 head of cattle. James hired a young man named Pete Wilson to help with the heavier work, giving James more time to spend with Eleanor and Thomas. They were not wealthy by any means, but they had enough. The ranch was starting to turn a profit, and they were able to save a little money each month. Eleanor returned to teaching when Thomas was a year old, bringing him with her to school. She set up a small play area in the corner of the schoolroom where Thomas could entertain himself while she taught. The students adored him, and the older girls would help watch him during recess. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it worked. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons and the small milestones of their growing family. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time she knew what to expect, and while the pregnancy was uncomfortable, she faced it with confidence. Their daughter was born in January of 1884, arriving quickly in the early morning hours. James barely had time to fetch Margaret before Eleanor was holding their daughter, a tiny thing with wispy blonde hair and Eleanor's green eyes. "She is going to be beautiful," James said, gazing at his daughter with wonder. "Just like her mother." They named her Sarah Rose, and if Thomas had been an easy baby, Sarah was his opposite. She cried frequently, fought sleep, and seemed determined to assert her will from the earliest age. Eleanor often joked that Sarah had inherited the stubbornness from both sides of the family in double measure. Despite the challenges, or perhaps because of them, Eleanor loved her fierce little daughter completely. Sarah kept her on her toes, constantly getting into mischief as she grew from baby to toddler. But she was also bright and affectionate, lavishing hugs and kisses on her parents and big brother. Thomas adored his little sister, showing remarkable patience when she knocked down his block towers or grabbed his toys. Eleanor would watch her children playing together and feel her heart swell with gratitude for this life she had built. The ranch continued to prosper. By 1886, they had over 50 head of cattle and had built a larger barn. James had proved himself to be an astute businessman, knowing when to buy and when to sell, building relationships with other ranchers and the buyers who came through looking for quality stock. They were able to hire 2 more hands, Mexican brothers named Carlos and Miguel, who worked hard and became friends as well as employees. One evening in the summer of 1886, as they sat on the porch watching Thomas and Sarah chase fireflies in the yard, James took Eleanor's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Giving up your old life for this one?" Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "Never, James, how could you even ask that?" he shrugged, but she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I just wonder sometimes if you miss the excitement of the city, the culture and refinement. I know I am not sophisticated or educated like the men you could have married in Philadelphia." Eleanor turned to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "Listen to me, James Cordell. You are the best man I have ever known. You are kind and hardworking and honorable. You are an amazing husband and father. You make me laugh every single day. You love me not in spite of who I am, but because of who I am. Do you know how rare that is? How precious?" "But you gave up so much," James protested. "I gave up nothing I wanted to keep," Eleanor said firmly. "I traded a life of empty sophistication for a life of purpose and love. I traded the loneliness of being surrounded by people who did not truly see me for the deep connection of being known completely by you. I would make that trade again in a heartbeat." James pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I love you, Eleanor, more than I have words to express." "I know, and I love you just as much, never doubt that." The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. There was a drought in 1887 that tested them severely, forcing them to drive the cattle to distant water sources and watch helplessly as the prairie turned brown and brittle. But they survived it, their reserves of strength and determination seeing them through. In 1888, Eleanor gave birth to their 3rd child, another boy they named William. He was a happy medium between Thomas's placid nature and Sarah's fiery spirit, easygoing but with a mischievous streak that kept Eleanor constantly vigilant. Thomas grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who loved learning and spent hours poring over the books Eleanor had brought from Philadelphia. Sarah was wild and free, happiest when she was outside helping her father with the ranch work. William was the charmer, able to talk his way out of trouble with a winning smile and quick wit. Eleanor continued teaching, loving the work even as it became more challenging to balance with raising 3 children. James supported her completely, taking over childcare duties on the days when Eleanor needed to stay late at school or prepare lessons. They were true partners in every sense, each supporting the other's dreams and aspirations. In 1890, when Thomas was 10, Sarah was 6, and William was 2, a railroad company announced plans to run a line through the area near Redemption. The news sent ripples of excitement through the town and surrounding ranches. A railroad meant easier access to markets, the ability to ship cattle directly to buyers in Fort Worth and beyond. It meant growth and prosperity. James saw the opportunity immediately. He began making plans to expand the ranch, taking out a loan to purchase an additional 100 acres adjacent to their property. It was a risk, But James was confident the railroad would transform their fortunes. Eleanor supported his decision, though the debt made her nervous. They had worked so hard to build what they had, and the thought of losing it was terrifying. But she trusted James's judgment, and she had learned that sometimes you had to take risks to move forward. The expansion paid off. When the railroad arrived in 1892, the Cordell Ranch was positioned perfectly to take advantage of it. James began shipping cattle directly, cutting out middlemen and increasing their profits substantially. Within 2 years, they had paid off the loan and were making more money than Eleanor had ever imagined possible. With their improved finances, James insisted on adding to the house. They built 2 more bedrooms, a larger kitchen, and a proper dining room. Eleanor was able to purchase books for the school, donating them so that all the children in Redemption would have access to literature and learning. Life was good. More than good. It was everything Eleanor had dreamed of and so much more. One afternoon in the fall of 1894, Eleanor was teaching when she looked out the schoolhouse window and saw a fancy carriage approaching. It was unusual enough to catch her attention, and she paused mid-sentence to watch it stop in front of the building. A well-dressed man in his 50s stepped out, looking around with obvious distaste at the dusty street and simple buildings of Redemption. Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition, though it took her a moment to place him. Then it clicked. He was Charles Morrison, a business associate of her father's from Philadelphia. "Children, please work on the arithmetic problems on the board quietly," Eleanor instructed, stepping outside to greet the unexpected visitor. Charles Morrison turned as she emerged, his expression shifting from disdain to surprise. "Miss Hayes, Eleanor Hayes." "It is Mrs. Cordell now," Eleanor corrected gently. "Mr. Morrison, what brings you to Redemption?" "Business in Fort Worth, and I heard that a woman matching your description was teaching school here. Your parents have been looking for you for years, Eleanor. They have been beside themselves with worry." Eleanor doubted that. More likely they had been beside themselves with anger and embarrassment. "I have written to them several times over the years. They chose not to respond." "They want you to come home," Morrison said bluntly. "Your father is prepared to forgive your youthful indiscretion. He has even convinced Theodore Blackwell to renew his offer of marriage." Eleanor almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Mr. Morrison, I am already married. I have been married for 16 years. I have 3 children and a life here that I love. I have no intention of returning to Philadelphia." Morrison looked shocked. "You married? To whom? Surely not to some common cowboy or rancher." "My husband is a rancher, yes, and a far better man than Theodore Blackwell could ever hope to be." Eleanor felt her temper rising. "I appreciate you taking the time to deliver the message, but my answer is no. I am not interested in reconciling with my parents if reconciliation means denying the life I have built here." "But Eleanor, think about what you are giving up, your family, your inheritance, your place in society." "I am not giving up anything," Eleanor said firmly. "I am choosing. I choose my husband and my children and this life. I choose love over obligation, authenticity over appearances. I choose to be happy, Mr. Morrison. Can you say the same?" Morrison looked at her as if she had grown a second head. Without another word, he climbed back into his carriage and directed the driver to leave. Eleanor watched him go, feeling not even a twinge of regret. That evening, she told James about the encounter. He listened quietly, his jaw tightening when she mentioned Theodore Blackwell's renewed proposal. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had stayed?" he asked when she finished. "No," Eleanor said simply. "That life was not real, James. It was a performance, a role I was expected to play. This is real. You and the children and the ranch and the school. This is my life, the one I chose and continue to choose every single day." James pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "I am so grateful you chose me," he murmured against her hair. "I am so grateful that day you stepped off the stagecoach and into my life." "I am grateful too," Eleanor whispered back, "for all of it, even the hard parts because they made us stronger." The next years brought more changes. Thomas, at 16, announced his intention to attend college in Fort Worth to study law. Eleanor was thrilled, seeing her own love of learning reflected in her eldest son. James was supportive but wistful, having hoped Thomas would want to take over the ranch, but he never tried to pressure Thomas into a path he did not want. Sarah, at 12, was as wild as ever, riding horses like she had been born in the saddle and declaring that she wanted to be a rancher like her father. She had no interest in the traditional feminine pursuits that Eleanor tried gently to teach her, preferring to spend her time working with the cattle. William, at 8, was still trying to figure out who he was and what he wanted. He loved stories and had begun writing his own, filling notebooks with adventures and tales that Eleanor found remarkably creative for someone so young. In 1897, tragedy struck the town when a fire broke out in the general store. Frank Sullivan was killed trying to save his stock, and Margaret was left a widow. The whole town mourned, and Eleanor spent hours comforting her friend, who had been so instrumental in helping Eleanor adjust to life in Redemption all those years ago. James organized a collection to help Margaret, and the ranchers and townspeople contributed generously. The store was rebuilt, and Margaret's grown sons came from their own homesteads to help run it. But Margaret was never quite the same afterward, the light in her eyes dimmed by grief. The loss reminded Eleanor of how precious and fragile life was. She held her children a little tighter, kissed James a little more frequently, and tried to find gratitude in every ordinary moment. In 1899, on the eve of a new century, the Cordell family gathered on their porch to watch the sunset. Thomas was home from college for the summer, grown into a serious young man who still retained his gentle nature. Sarah was 15, tall and strong and fiercely independent. William was 11, still dreaming and writing his stories. Eleanor sat in the rocking chair James had made for her 20th anniversary, watching her family with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. James stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "I am thinking about how strange life is," Eleanor replied. 21 years ago, I stepped off a stagecoach into a town I had never seen, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. I thought the West would be my great adventure, my escape from the constraints of my old life. I had no idea it would become so much more than that. "What did it become?" James asked, though she suspected he knew the answer. "It became my home, my heart, my whole world." Eleanor reached up to cover his hands with hers. "You once told me that the West was not lonely anymore because I was here. But the truth is, I was not lonely anymore because you were here. You took a scared city girl and showed her what real love looked like. You gave me a family and a purpose and a life worth living." Thomas, overhearing, smiled at his parents. "Are you two being sappy again? Leave them alone," Sarah said, nudging her brother. "I think it is nice that they still love each other so much." "Of course we still love each other," James said. "Your mother is the best thing that ever happened to me." "Why would that change? Some of my friends' parents barely tolerate each other," William observed. "You two actually seem to like being together." "We do," Eleanor confirmed. "Your father is my best friend as well as my husband. That makes all the difference." As darkness fell and the stars emerged, the family remained on the porch, talking and laughing together. Eleanor thought about all the years that had passed since she first arrived in Redemption, about all the challenges they had faced and overcome. The drought and the storm damage and the lean times. The losses and the fears and the moments of doubt, but through it all, James had been beside her. They had built this life together, brick by brick, decision by decision, day by day, and it was beautiful. The new century brought more changes. Thomas graduated from college and took a position with a law firm in Fort Worth, though he came home to visit regularly. Sarah, true to her word, took over more and more of the ranch operations, proving herself to be even more capable than James had been at her age. She had inherited her father's instincts for the business and her mother's fierce determination. William surprised everyone by deciding to become a teacher like his mother. Eleanor could not have been more proud, spending hours helping him prepare for the certification exam. When he passed and took a position at a school in a neighboring town, Eleanor felt like her legacy would continue through him. In 1905, at the age of 49, Eleanor decided it was time to retire from teaching. She had taught for 27 years, educating hundreds of children. It was time to pass the torch to a new generation. The town threw her a retirement party, and Eleanor was moved to tears by the number of former students who came to thank her for the impact she had made on their lives. James, now 52, began gradually turning over the ranch operations to Sarah, who at 21 was more than ready to take on the responsibility. He still worked, but at a slower pace, enjoying having more time to spend with Eleanor. They traveled some, taking the train to visit Thomas in Fort Worth and William in his town. They even made a trip to Denver, marveling at how much the West had changed since Eleanor first arrived. The frontier was disappearing, replaced by cities and farms and civilization. But Redemption remained much as it had been, a small town on the prairie where everyone knew everyone else. The schoolhouse where Eleanor had taught had been expanded and improved, but it was still the same building. The church where she and James had married still held services every Sunday. The general store, rebuilt after the fire, still served as the town's gathering place. In 1910, Thomas married a lawyer's daughter from Fort Worth, and a year later they had a son, making Eleanor and James grandparents for the first time. Holding her grandson, Eleanor felt the circle of life continuing, the next generation taking its place. Sarah showed no interest in marriage, declaring that the ranch was enough for her. Eleanor worried about her daughter being lonely, but Sarah insisted she was happy. "I have my family and my work," she would say. "What more could I need?" William married a fellow teacher, and they had twin girls in 1913. Eleanor loved visiting them, reading to her granddaughters and teaching them the same stories and poems she had taught their father. One evening in 1915, as Eleanor and James sat on their porch watching another sunset, James said, "We have lived a good life, have we not?" Eleanor smiled, taking his hand. They were both in their late 50s now, their hair gray and their faces lined with the marks of time and sun and hard work. But James was still handsome to her, still the cowboy who had welcomed her to Redemption and told her she mattered. "We have lived the best life," Eleanor corrected. "I would not change a single thing." "Not even the hard parts?" James asked. "Not even those." "The hard parts taught us what we were made of. They showed us that we could survive anything as long as we were together." James brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "Do you remember what you said that first evening when I asked how you were finding Redemption?" "I said the West was lonelier than I had imagined," Eleanor recalled. "And I said not anymore because you were here. I meant it, Eleanor. You transformed everything. You took a solitary cowboy and taught him what it meant to truly live, not just exist. You gave me purpose and joy and love. You gave me a family and a home. You gave me everything." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. After all these years, James could still move her with his words. "You gave me the same things, my love. You gave me freedom and acceptance and a place where I could be fully myself. You gave me children and grandchildren and a life of meaning. You gave me your heart, and I have treasured it every single day." They sat in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the sky turn from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear Sarah calling instructions to the ranch hands. Closer by, the sounds of cattle lowing and horses nickering in the barn provided a familiar soundtrack. This was home. This life they had built together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. The ranch was prosperous now, the house comfortable, their children grown and happy. They had weathered every storm, overcome every obstacle, and emerged stronger for it. "Do you think you will ever write your memoir?" James asked, nodding toward the leather journal he had given her so many years ago. Eleanor had filled it and several others with her thoughts and observations about their life together. "Perhaps someday," Eleanor said. I want to write down our story for the grandchildren, so they will know where they came from. So they will understand that true love is not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It is about choosing each other every single day, even when things are difficult. It is about building a life together one moment at a time. That is a good message, James agreed. Though I think our story also shows that sometimes you have to take a chance on something new, something scary, to find where you truly belong. That is true, Eleanor said. If I had not been brave enough to leave Philadelphia, if I had not taken that stagecoach west, we never would have met. Our children would not exist. This whole beautiful life would never have happened. And if I had not been brave enough to speak to a lonely schoolteacher on her porch that first evening, we might have remained strangers, James added. Sometimes I think about that, about all the little choices that had to happen for us to end up here together. It feels like fate. Or grace, Eleanor suggested. The grace of God bringing two lonely people together and giving them a chance at happiness. They sat until full darkness had fallen and the stars were bright overhead. The same stars James had taught Eleanor to identify all those years ago. The Big Dipper and Cassiopeia and Orion the Hunter. The constellations that had witnessed their courtship and their marriage and the building of their life together. Finally, James stood and offered Eleanor his hand. "Come on, Mrs. Cordell, let us go inside and warm up by the fire." Eleanor took his hand and rose, following him into the house they had built together. As she closed the door behind them, she took one last look at the prairie stretching endlessly into the darkness. It was still vast, still wild, still capable of making a person feel small and insignificant. But Eleanor no longer felt lonely looking at it. She had James and their children and their grandchildren. She had a life full of love and purpose and meaning. The West had tested her, challenged her, and ultimately embraced her. She had arrived as a frightened city girl and had become a rancher's wife, a mother, a grandmother, a teacher who had shaped young minds for nearly 3 decades. She had found her place in the world, and it was here on this Texas prairie with the man who had seen her, truly seen her, from the very first day. The man who had loved her not for who she was supposed to be, but for who she truly was. In the years that followed, Eleanor did write her memoir, filling pages with the story of her journey west and the life she had built with James. She wrote about the challenges and the triumphs, the heartbreaks and the joys. She wrote about what it meant to be brave enough to leave everything familiar behind in search of something more, but most of all, she wrote about love. The kind of love that sustained through hardship and celebrated through success. The kind of love that grew deeper with each passing year rather than fading. The kind of love that transformed 2 individuals into a partnership stronger than the sum of its parts. Sarah eventually did marry, at the age of 35, to a widowed rancher from a neighboring county. They merged their properties and became one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. Sarah had 3 stepchildren who adored her, and she proved to be a wonderful stepmother, patient and kind despite her gruff exterior. Thomas became a prominent lawyer in Fort Worth, arguing cases all the way to the state Supreme Court. He and his wife had 4 children in total, and they would bring the whole family to the ranch every summer, the house ringing with the laughter and chaos of grandchildren. William continued teaching and writing, eventually publishing a collection of stories about life in the West that became quite popular. He credited his mother with instilling in him the love of words and stories that had shaped his life. James lived to see all his children settled and happy, all his grandchildren growing strong and healthy. He continued working the ranch into his 70s, slowing down but never fully stopping. The land was in his blood, as essential to him as breathing. On his 75th birthday, the family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. Children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren filled the house and spilled out onto the porch and yard. There was food and music and laughter, and James stood in the middle of it all with Eleanor beside him, marveling at what they had created. "Not bad for a city girl and a cowboy," Eleanor whispered to him, squeezing his hand. James smiled, the same warm smile that had captured her heart so many years ago. Not bad at all. In fact, I would say it is just about perfect. That night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, James and Eleanor sat once more on their porch. It had become their ritual over the decades, this evening time to reflect and reconnect. James's hair was fully white now, his face deeply lined, but his eyes still held that same spark Eleanor had fallen in love with. "I have been thinking about something," James said quietly. "About that first evening when you told me the West was lonelier than you had imagined." "I remember," Eleanor said, "and you told me it was not lonely anymore because I was here." "I was trying to be comforting," James admitted, "trying to make you feel welcome. But the truth is, I was the lonely one. I had been lonely for years without even realizing it. I had work and acquaintances, but I did not have anyone who truly knew me, who saw past the surface to who I really was. Then you arrived and everything changed. You did not just make the West less lonely for me, Eleanor, you made me whole." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks. After all these years, James could still surprise her with the depth of his emotion. "You made me whole too," she whispered. "I did not even know I was broken until I met you and realized what I had been missing. Love, real love, the kind that accepts and challenges and celebrates. You gave me that, James. You gave me everything." They held each other as the stars wheeled overhead and the prairie wind whispered through the grass. Two people who had taken a chance on each other and built something beautiful from nothing but faith and hope and love. Eleanor lived to be 82 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1938. James followed her just 3 months later, unable or unwilling to face life without his partner. They were buried side by side in the Redemption Cemetery under a simple stone that read, "James and Eleanor Cordell, united in life and in death, their love endures." Their children divided the ranch, each taking a portion and continuing the legacy their parents had built. The Cordell name became synonymous with quality cattle and honest dealing throughout the region. Future generations would work the land, each adding their own chapter to the family story. But it all started with a lonely schoolteacher stepping off a stagecoach and a cowboy brave enough to speak to her. It started with a conversation on a porch under the stars and a simple declaration, "Not anymore, you are here." Those words had been a promise, though neither of them had known it at the time. A promise that Eleanor would never be lonely again, that she had found her place and her person. A promise that James had kept every single day of their long life together. In the end, Eleanor's journey west had been about more than escape or adventure or even teaching. It had been about finding herself, finding love, and finding home. The West had been lonelier than she had imagined that first day in Redemption. But it had also been more beautiful, more challenging, more rewarding, and more full of love than she ever could have dreamed. She had left Philadelphia as Eleanor Hayes, a constrained young woman playing a role she did not believe in. She had died as Eleanor Cordell, a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply and left a legacy that would endure for generations. The ranch still stands, though it has been expanded and modernized over the decades. The house James built with his own hands has been preserved as the heart of the property, with additions and improvements made by each successive generation. If you visit on a quiet evening, you can almost feel the presence of those who came before, the love that was poured into every board and beam. And if you sit on the porch as the sun sets and the stars emerge, you might feel what Eleanor felt all those years ago. That sense of belonging, of being exactly where you are meant to be, of finding home not in a place, but in connection with another soul. The story of James and Eleanor Cordell became legend in Redemption, passed down through families as an example of what love should look like. The schoolteacher from Philadelphia and the Texas cowboy who built a life together against all odds. Who faced droughts and storms and heartbreak and came through it all stronger and more united. Their great-great-grandchildren still work the ranch, still tell stories about the ancestors who started it all. They speak of Eleanor's courage in leaving everything she knew to venture west. They speak of James's devotion to the woman who transformed his life. They speak of the love that sustained through hardship and celebrated through joy. And they remember the words that started it all, the simple declaration that changed two lives forever. The West is lonelier than I imagined. Not anymore, you are here. Those words had been more than comfort or courtesy. They had been prophecy. A prediction of the life they would build together, the love they would share, the family they would create. A promise that neither of them would ever be lonely again, because they had found each other. In the end, that is what every love story is really about. Finding the person who makes you whole, who sees you truly, who chooses you every single day. Eleanor and James had that kind of love, and it sustained them through 43 years of marriage and continues to inspire generations after them. Their story reminds us that sometimes the greatest adventures come from the choices we make out of hope rather than fear. That home is not a place but a feeling found in connection with another soul. That love, real love, is worth every sacrifice, every challenge, every moment of doubt. Eleanor had thought she was coming west to teach school and have an adventure, but she had found so much more. She had found purpose and passion and a love that transformed everything. She had found James, and in finding him, she had found herself. And James, who had been drifting through life thinking he was content, had discovered what he had been missing. Someone to share the sunsets with, to dream with, to build a future with. Someone who made the vast emptiness of the prairie feel full and rich and complete. Together, they had proved that love could flourish anywhere, even in the harsh landscape of the Texas frontier. That two people from completely different worlds could create something beautiful together. That the loneliness of the West could be transformed into the warmth of home, simply by finding the right person to share it with. Their love story began on a dusty street in a small town in 1878 and continued for the rest of their lives. A testament to the power of choosing love over fear, of taking risks for the possibility of happiness, of building a life one day at a time with the person who makes you whole. The West had been lonely for both of them in different ways, but together they had filled that emptiness with love and family and purpose. Together they had transformed loneliness into belonging, uncertainty into stability, dreams into reality. And it all started with a simple conversation on a porch under the stars, with words that would echo through the decades. Not anymore, you are here. Those words had been true then, and they remained true throughout their entire lives. Eleanor and James were never lonely again, because they had found in each other everything they had been searching for without knowing it. Love, partnership, home, and happiness. Their story is a reminder that sometimes the best things in life come when we are brave enough to step into the unknown, to leave behind what is comfortable for what calls to our hearts. Eleanor took that brave step when she boarded a stagecoach to Texas. James took that brave step when he spoke to a lonely schoolteacher on her porch. And both of them reaped the rewards of that bravery for the rest of their lives, building a love that endured through hardship and celebrated through triumph. A love that created a family and a legacy that would last for generations. In the end, the West was not lonely at all. It was full of possibility, full of opportunity, full of love waiting to be found. Eleanor and James found it together, and in doing so, they created a story that would inspire everyone who heard it. A story of love conquering loneliness, of two souls finding each other across the vastness of the frontier, of building a life together that was richer and fuller than anything either of them could have imagined alone. The West had called to Eleanor, promising adventure and freedom. It had delivered both, along with something even more precious. A love that lasted a lifetime and beyond, a partnership that transformed two individuals into something greater than the sum of their parts, a home not built of wood and stone but of shared dreams and mutual devotion. James and Eleanor Cordell lived their great love story on the Texas prairie, and though they have been gone for many years now, Their love endures. It lives on in their descendants, in the ranch they built, in the stories told around family gatherings, in the lesson they taught about what really matters in life, not wealth or status or sophistication, but love. Simple, enduring, transformative love between two people brave enough to choose each other and committed enough to keep choosing each other through all the days of their lives. That was their legacy. That was their gift to the generations that followed. That was the lesson Eleanor wrote about in her memoir, and that their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry forward. Love is worth the risk. Love is worth the sacrifice. Love is worth leaving everything behind to find. And when you find it, when you find that person who makes the loneliness disappear and the world makes sense, you hold on tight and never let go. Eleanor and James held on to each other for 43 beautiful years, and in doing so, they created something that would outlast them both. A love story for the ages, a testament to the power of two hearts finding each other and choosing to beat as one. The West was lonely until it was not. Until two people found each other and filled that emptiness with love. That is the story of James and Eleanor Cordell, the cowboy and the schoolteacher who built a life together on the Texas frontier and proved that love can flourish anywhere, as long as two people are willing to nurture it together. And it all began with those simple, prophetic words. Not anymore, you are here. Words that changed everything. Words that promised a future neither of them could have imagined. Words that came true in ways more beautiful and profound than either of them could have dreamed. Not anymore, you are here, not lonely, not lost, not uncertain, here together building a life and a love that would endure for all time. Here creating a legacy of devotion and partnership that would inspire generations to come. Here finding home in each other's arms and happiness in each other's eyes. That was the story. That was the truth. That was the love that conquered loneliness and transformed two lives into one beautiful, shared journey through life. Eleanor and James Cordell, united forever by the love they found on a dusty street in Redemption, Texas, in the summer of 1878. A love that lasted a lifetime and echoes still in the hearts of all who know their story. The end.